All right, we're going to make this real quick so we can get into the interview. I talked to Jonathan Edward Durham about Winterset Hollow, his writing process, movies, and the Suntup Edition. Amazing guy. I will tell you, at some point in the video, I say, well, now we're getting a little spoilerish. If you've not read Winterset Hollow, stop watching at that point because we definitely get into some spoilers after that marker. But I say spoiler-ish. That's your clue to hop out when I say now we're getting into something a little spoiler. I'm just warning you. I don't have the timestamp because of this new editing program. I'm not going to get into that. I'm not getting into that. So check out the interview. He's a great guy. The story's an amazing story. And I had a lot of fun talking to him. So I hope you have a lot of fun watching me talk to him. Please ignore the parts where I'm talking.
For once, I'm not talking to myself. It's time to go beyond the book and get over your shell. Thank you for joining me today. I just finished Winterset Hollow. I loved it, absolutely loved it. And then looking at your background and all the possible paths that could have led you to writing such a book, it doesn't seem a linear path. I mean,
it wasn't.
So how did you get here?
I mean, starting, it's a long answer. I mean, I didn't start writing anything really until I was probably 30 or so. I mean, I had done it through school and was good at it and sort of knew I was good at it, but never considered doing it, professionally or anything like that. And I, was in the professional world for, 10 years and it just, I don't know, wasn't pushing the buttons I needed to be pushed in my life. And I finally sort of came to that realization. So I decided to try something, creative for a living. So I started writing screenplays. And did that for 7 or 8 years or so, not tremendously successfully, never really had anything produced, but sort of made enough to keep myself fed and that sort of thing. Did that for a while, was good because I felt like it put me through like story boot camp a little bit. Because, being a screenwriter is very much about telling a story, in the most direct way possible and no fluff. And so in a way, I felt it was like really educational in that way.
Did you have a partnership with some producers, a studio?
So I wrote a couple really terrible screenplays at first, which everybody does. And then eventually I wrote a pretty good one and it won a big national contest and got optioned by a really well-known producer. And that's what prompted me to basically pack up and move, out to Los Angeles. So that's how that happened.
That is cool. So were you writing screenplays based on other people's work or were these all original?
Yeah, they were all original spec stuff. Just, ideas I had kicking around in my head and that sort of thing.
So what won the award? Did it ever get made?
No, it never got made. Nothing I've written actually ever got made. I've had, a laundry list of things optioned and I've actually sold a couple series to studios and that sort of thing. But some of them got really close, but nothing ever ended up on the screen, which is part of the reason I decided to try books, because I just got frustrated with putting all this work into everything and not really having anything to show for it, and like nobody even read anything I've written except for agents and producers and executives and that sort of thing. Like, so, I just got to the point where I was like, I think I need to find a more direct way to do this, because at the end of the day, all a writer wants is for people to read and enjoy their stuff,
Exactly. And so what's stunning about it is that, yeah, like you said, a screenplay is a bare bones story. It's like, who's saying what and what is the action they're taking?
That's exactly right.
And this book is overflowing. Like it is bursting with ideas, words, prose. It's anything but bare bones. I mean, really.
Yeah. You know what? I think to a degree, some of that was just like years of that being pent up. Like
I was gonna say, was it super frustrating?
Yeah, it was. And part of that is just like, oh, I finally get to do this. Like I finally get to talk about like what people are thinking and what people are feeling. And I got to talk about stuff in the past that has happened and stuff that might happen. And like, and it I think it complemented the book well, because part of what I was sort of trying to do was, it's a very fast-paced book. And, part of it is, it's exciting. And I wanted to balance that with sort of the language being sort of the opposite of that, and to find like a good balance there, that the book feels like complete. So I didn't really, I found myself sort of leaning into that a little bit, and I think it worked well in the final result. But yeah, there's just years of like, when do I finally get to talk about this stuff? You know what I mean?
When you have the power of this fantasy, the heights are as staggering as the depths. Do you categorize it as horror, or do you call it dark fantasy?
I don't even, I still don't know the answer to that question. I mean, the book's been out almost 2 years, and it's sold however many hundreds of thousands of copies. I don't know. I mean, I initially, when it came out, I wouldn't have put it in the category of horror, but like that community is really, really embraced it. And I didn't know to really make it that at first. But it's certainly not extreme horror, maybe maybe more of a classic horror, with a little bit of gothic. I don't know. Parts of it, I think you could make an argument for. I don't know if I would put it in that. I have a tough time categorizing any of my stories because they're all a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And I don't think about stories in terms of genre when I write them. I just try to follow the story, and so they always end up a little bit of mix and match sort of thing. So
I hedged a little bit when you said classic horror, only because I think that's too limiting. To me, it feels like if the Grimm fairy tales had been in modern day, in this modern day celebrity seeking world, like, do you really want to know the roots of your beauty?
I totally get that. I mean, it's funny you mentioned that, because when I think about the things that scare me, it's never violence or like jump scares or stuff that's grotesque or gory. None of that scares me. Like, what scares me is the horror of reality. You know what I mean? Like,
oh yeah,
people being evil, and like the terror of being alone, and like that's the sort of stuff that really, really gets me. So that tends to be the stuff that works its way into my my stories.
Yeah, when people talk about horror, I think I usually don't get scared from a book unless it's a true crime book. But
sure.
When but thrilled, excited, and shocked, and sort of, I think that is all in this book. So if you want to use those words to describe a horror book, then that's fair game.
Yeah, I think it's fair game to call it that. Sure, I think it's fair game to call it a number of other things too. I've heard people make really great arguments for, all sorts of different genres. So I'm here for all of it.
Yeah. Is that so? This is your first book, your first out in the wild, and it's a huge hit. I saw it, and that actually, I don't know. I'm just a contrarian, I guess. But when a book is super buzzy, I'll like avoid it. I'm like,
yeah, no, I hear you.
If everybody's talking about it, and this book was all over the place, and only after Suntup said they were doing it, I'm like, okay, like it's
a pretty serious endorsement, isn't it? Like,
it's huge, because for me, I've always been like, I remember this one Supreme Court justice said all of his clerks come from Harvard, and they're like, why don't you get other law clerks from these other places? He's like, because Harvard vetted them. What else do I need to know?
They've done the work for me. Yeah.
Right. So Suntup is my vetting. And so it did force me to take another look. And when I read the synopsis, I'm like, oh, this is pretty cool. It can't possibly be as good as the synopsis and all this buzz, though. And it was. And
oh, thank you.
So I'm here to say, and it's, for me, I think a book is satisfying when it's got a great story, or it's written beautifully, or it's super original. And this book happens to have all of it. And so we'll get to what's next later, but
okay.
I'm like, this is one hell of a home run out the gate. And has there been anything that people have missed about this book that you're like, nobody's talked about this part of it?
I don't think so, man. I mean, people have dug so deep into this thing that they've really hit it all. Like, I mean, I sometimes read the stuff that people write about it, and I'm like, wow, like, not everything, not every message that ends up in a book is intentional, believe it or not. You know what I mean? Like, much of it comes from like your lateral mind, and there's just pieces of it here and there, and you don't necessarily see the whole picture until somebody else points it out. And I mean, I've seen people point stuff out about the book that I just went, whoa, like, I didn't really even realize that was there. And so what do you do? Do you own up to that, or do you just sort of go, yep, like, that's great that you noticed that? Or, it's like, oh, no, I mean, people have really, People have really gotten some amazing stuff out of this book, and there's nothing I can think of really that anybody's missed.
Now, is it scary?
Maybe
for
some
you?
personal stuff that
Oh,
you know that they shouldn't have gotten because it's just sort of between me and the book a little bit, you know.
yeah.
But, yeah.
Well, I noticed that I was going to ask you if any of it was autobiographical, because there's the naming obviously stood out. There's, Edward is Edward Addington. Jonathan Eamon is his hidden first name. And there's a lot of things that I'm just going off of your name, that sort of connected some dots for me.
Yeah, I mean, some of it is definitely autobiographical. I would have a hard time writing a book, putting a year or two of your life into something and having it not being autographical. Like, I feel like you almost have to have it mean that much. So there's definitely pieces of every character that are me a little bit. There's a lot of Eamon that is me. There's a bit of each of the animals, that are me. So, and a little bit of Edward too. So in that way, it's for sure a little autobiographical. Yeah.
Now, this is a book where another thing I thought was really well done about it is that I could not hate the villains in the story. I couldn't hate them. I could not look at them and say, like, oh, you're just so vile. I hope you lose. No,
you can hate the things they do, but like, it's hard to hate them. Yeah. No, I mean, that's my favorite kind of villain. Like, I like a gray villain, because I think it's the most interesting way to sort of paint somebody. Because I mean, for the most part, people have reasons. Even if the stuff they do is, terrible, there's usually a reason. There's usually a story behind that. And so I feel like that's what makes a character interesting, and particularly a villain. I've had so many people say that exact same thing. Like, you had me rooting for the antagonist at the end of it. And I get a kick out of that, man.
And the thing is, you spread out their qualities amongst, 4 or 5 characters that they each are different. They're each motivated differently. They're each struggling differently. And only one is clearly not struggling, and I think he was my
maybe
favorite.
Enjoying it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's about, like, they each, have gone through some terribly traumatic stuff, and it's about them each processing it in different ways. Like we all do. You know what I mean?
Right.
Some of us try to ignore it. Some of us pour ourselves into hobbies. Some of us get angry. Some of us just want to go away and be alone. And so they each have their own way of processing, like, this awful history that they share. And so that would, what unites them, but also makes them, different.
What prompted this story? Like, were you trying to take down Winnie the Pooh, or like what?
No, it's funny you mentioned that. It did sort of spring from that sort of story, because I loved that sort of story as a kid. And no, one day I just found myself sitting around and thinking, wouldn't it be, first of all, why do people love stories like that, like Winnie the Pooh? And I think it's because those animals have very real human problems. Eeyores are depressive, and like Rabbit's anxious, and Pooh's an overeater, and then Tigger's has ADHD, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And then I sort of started thinking, well, what if they were aware that they were in a book? And furthermore, like, what if they didn't like it? And what if you could have a conversation with them about that? And it sort of just snowballed from that sort of thinking. So I didn't really set out to take down any one book in particular. I sort of borrowed pieces from a bunch of different books that I loved to create the characters, because they're all supposed to feel familiar. You know what I mean? They're supposed to feel like you almost know them from other stories that you've read, and that you sort of know them already, and that sort of thing. So that sort of thing is very much intentional. But I didn't really have one book in mind, in particular.
Yeah, you said you're a voracious reader. What were you ingesting? Like, what were the books that you kept getting pulled toward
at the time? Or you just mean like the
growing up? So you've obviously fed your imagination well.
Yeah, I mean, when I was really, really young, it's all the sort of the anthropomorphic animal stories were huge, but I also loved dark stuff, like Where the Wild Things Are. And as I got older, it was a lot of fantasy and C.S. Lewis, and that sort of thing. And then as I got a little older, like sort of early teens, my dad is a huge reader too, and this was sort of the 90s when mass market thrillers were like the thing.
Yeah.
So it was a lot of like, Stephen King and John Grisham and Michael Crichton, who was like maybe my favorite of that era. And
Really?
so, yeah. And so he would read all these books and I would read them all when he was done. So I grew up with this combination of like really, really cool classical fantasy and then like also sort of poppy thrillers with big stories. And I think that combination had a lot to do with my development of like what stories I like, and I sort of like stuff that's a little bit of both of those things.
It definitely comes through. Like I said before about the formula, it has to be, I'm a sucker. I will give a lot of credit to there's a beautiful book that I read. I don't know if other people call it beautiful, but The Grip of It by I will mess up her name. It's Jack Jemack, Jemc. Is her last name, and it is so beautifully written. The story goes absolutely nowhere, but I loved reading it. But I could tell you obviously have a love of the pacing and the plotting, and
Sure.
And so I think that came through. And obviously, it's not just this exercise in literature. Like,
No,
on one hand, I thought you were making a bigger allegory, and that was your whole reason for writing the book. And on the other, I'm like, but there's so much other stuff going on. It was hard for me to suss out.
Yeah, I don't. Starting with an allegory is really hard for me. I don't really do that. I sometimes I feel like you can tell when a book does that, and it's not always my favorite thing to read. However, I think
exactly
if you start with an interesting story and find interesting conversations within it, I think that for me is a book I would like to read more. And it's like you don't always set out to say X, Y, or Z. I think sometimes for me personally, it's better when you set out to talk about X, Y, and Z. And then if you can find something interesting to say in there, that's good stuff. And it doesn't come across as like heavy-handed. It just comes across as interesting and like woven within the story in a way that's not intrusive.
For sure. That sums up, because I always bash books that I think have an agenda instead of a story.
Mm-hmm.
And I criticize myself because I'm like, well, you got to have a humans expressing an idea. And so
Sure.
if there's something bigger to say, because obviously I couldn't help but think of well, I don't know if this gets into spoiler territory, but I couldn't help but think of like Native American displacement going on and things like that sort of made me wonder if that was at all something there. I'm not asking a question, but
I tell you what, that sort of popped up out of nowhere when I was in the middle of writing it, and I really had zero intention of talking about that at all. And to this day, I'm still not sure. I didn't want to make it an overt conversation because I'm not sure it's like my place to add anything to that conversation, frankly.
Right.
But it popped up and it was there, and I didn't really feel right about deleting it either. And in the context of the story, it kind of makes sense. So I just sort of left the bits there that were there, and sort of hoped that was okay for me to do that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think it's it's our job as human beings to wonder about how other human beings are getting along. And so how did you get this book published? Like who did it? I don't even know who did it.
So I, did the usual query thing for a while, and it got picked up by a publisher. And about halfway through that publishing process, I was unhappy with the direction of it, and I pulled it from them.
Awesome. That is brave. I mean, seriously.
It was a huge decision, and it's funny. I remember at the time I had struggled for so long as an unknown screenwriter that like the title of being a published author like meant so much that I was enamored with it. So it was a really hard thing to do, but with the advice of like my family and my husband, and we finally decided just to pull it and see what happened. And so I actually ended up publishing it myself. I mean, so it's technically a self-published book. The publisher that you see associated there is a family friend who helped me through the process.
I had no idea.
Yeah, helped me through the formatting and editing and that sort of thing. but yeah, so that's the story.
Wow. That is really amazing. If you don't mind telling me, what was
Sure.
what were the roadblocks with the publisher?
Um, they had some issues with some of the content that I thought should stay in the book. And apart from that, it just became clear as we were going through this process that like they were probably not going to put the work into it that I thought was necessary. So
For marketing and such?
for marketing and for a number of different aspects. And I was just like, this doesn't feel right. And like the story to me felt like it was worth more than the effort that was being put in. And I was like, I can do more than this. Like nobody's going to work harder for this than I'm going to. And
Wow.
particularly I thought the people I was involved with. So that's sort of how that went down.
That I can't stress that enough. I mean, like you said, you're this uncredited or this unacknowledged screenwriter, gets this sort of deal, and then stands up for what you believe in the story, and it worked. I mean, it was worth standing up for, I think. So how do you feel to get the recognition from Suntup?
It feels weird. I was pretty shocked when they first reached out to me. I thought it was a scam. Like I didn't think it was them. To be frank, I was like, this can't be. Like this can't
Wow.
actually be. Because like I knew who Suntup was. Like I'm a book geek, and I love there's nothing I love more than like a special edition of anything, particularly to the level that they do it. Like which is And so when Jason first reached out to me, I was like, this can't actually be them. Like, but it turns out it was. So I was blown away. It was like, talk about validation.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
it's incredible. It felt great. It still feels great. And I don't know, the stuff they do is so beautiful. And like,
Yeah.
it's such a tribute to books. And like, when you look at their catalog, like, I was just like this, you talk about, Jaws and Animal Farm and like just all these classic books. And then like mine, it's very, very strange. But like it meant a lot and still means a lot.
Well, I think that Suntup does a lot of books that are really culturally significant, important. Suntup does books for people who love books and who appreciate the idea that this deserves a bigger pedestal. And that to me is I think Paul might be a little clairvoyant. He could see where things are going. And this book is also a book lover's book.
Yeah. Yes. Well, it's a book about a book in a lot of ways,
Right. But these people
it's a book about books. Yeah.
But they're so geeked out. Like I am Eamon, totally. Like this book, if a book changes your life, then it means something so deep. It's in your DNA, and you'll, I mean, it's just a little tourist thing they're doing, but still and I think a lot of the Suntup readers understand and appreciate that. And it's going to bring your work to a lot more people. How do you feel about that? Like,
I mean, it's great. A wider audience is always great. Like that's all you ask for. I mean, you can't really ask for positive or negative, criticism either way or feedback. Like all you can ask is for a chance for either of those. You know what I mean? And so like a new audience is it's everything. So it's fantastic. We'll see what the reaction is, I suppose.
Now, how do you feel about the subtext of the book is like these people, Edward Addington is like the height of luxury and an over consumption. And like you'd imagine he would have a bunch of Suntup lettered editions.
Totally. Yeah. It's funny that you say that. I mean, I certainly have a little bit of Edward in me, and I think a lot of us do. And, is it okay to make that your identity? Like, probably not. Is it okay to indulge in a little bit of that? I mean, yeah. I think so. It's like there are so few things that any of us find, especially these days, to make us happy, that like, if you find something you want and you can afford it, go ahead and do it. And like, we all know the beauty of like just having books to look at and just
Yeah.
like knowing they're there. And, so yeah, if you want a special edition of one, do it. I mean, I buy them. So if it makes you happy to have them, then great.
Have you seen the designs for Winterset Hollow yet?
So I've seen the art, the interior art.
Yeah,
and
I
it's
haven't.
it's awesome.
Is it?
Yeah.
Who did the art in this one, in the trade?
So the interior stuff is done by an artist named Jay LaBelle.
Oh,
Yep.
okay.
So he did all the like wood print looking things at the beginning of the parts,
Cool.
which are just awesome.
And Runny the Rabbit. Yeah, I can obviously superimpose photos over instead of the hokey holding it up, but I mean, it definitely adds to the vibe. It's necessary in a lot of records.
I think so too. I think it makes it feel really complete, and it makes it feel a little like I wanted the book itself to feel a little bit like the book Addington wrote might have felt. You know what I mean? And I think it does. I like that vibe, that synergy.
I think it would be awesome. I know nothing. All I know is that all I knew was that Suntup was doing Winterset Hollow, and then I read the book, and here we are. But so I haven't seen the art. I haven't seen the production. I think it would be awesome if they did a compendium or an additional book that is the Edward Addington book.
Yeah. So many people have asked for that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that I think it will probably happen at some point. There are, however, I think a couple more books, prequels down the road, that will probably also potentially have excerpts from his book in there. So maybe when the story is all said and done, that would be a nice thing to do, is sort of put it all together.
Man.
Yeah.
Oh man. All right. Well, this is a little spoilish territory, but so are we gonna find out about King and Queenie and the hounds?
So there's definitely questions in Winterset Hollow that I would like to answer for people. And I mean, having read the book, there's obviously not much territory for sequels, you know what I mean? But prequels, I think there's a lot of great stories on the island that are worth exploring for sure.
In getting back to what we said about gaining sympathy or about feeling, some sort of like, all right, these villains are bad, but dude, they're traumatized.
There are, and I think there's opportunities to flip that a little bit and have them kind of straight up be protagonists in the right story. You know what I mean? Like,
I think the moment Finn guts Edward would be a moment the fans would cheer. I think.
Yeah, I think there's really interesting stories that'll that, like I said, that could paint everybody in a different light, and just paint a deeper picture of what they've gone through and that sort of thing. So I think at some point that's probably going to happen, although I'm not sure when yet. So
I think some of the stuff with the hounds, man, that it was dark. I think when Runny is at the mirror with himself, it's like that's the first moment you're like, oh,
that's the first really dark moment where you're like, oh, okay, this is
and then the hounds, for me, those two things were like, that took it to a place that was so, because I think to be clear, if I'm going to be horrified at a book, it's when a person's dehumanized. And for me, that's worse than death. And when you got to the hounds, like what place did you explore to come up with that? That's
I don't really remember. All I remember is the idea of, earlier in the book, there's like a painting of a fox hunt. You know what I mean? And for some reason I was thinking about that, and what is the inverse of that? And for whatever reason, it clicked that like, oh, what if Edward had hounds at one point, now that Finn's in charge, what would he do? And that was just sort of how that came about. So.
Yeah, and I think that also spoke to why there were no people who ever left the island. And one one thing I was wondering is why does Gene just drop people off and never come back?
So there's, I mean, that's one of the things that'll be explored in the prequel. He's got some backstory too.
That's what I was. Yeah. And,
yeah. So
I think that I took that as that's why he let Eamon take the boat back.
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
There are things he's looking to sort of make up for, and yeah, exactly.
Because I thought too, because yeah, you know, now that I did have a whole lot of other things that are like, these animals lived on this island and they had all these resources to reach out to get the book to Eamon and all these things. They had to be pulling strings pretty impressively.
So I think, yeah, I mean, that is also one of the things. I mean, I can give a little bit away. I mean, part of that is sort of Olivia and her network, you know, of the owls and that sort of thing. But there's a super one particular dark reason they were able to do all that again, like, will be explored in the prequel. So,
oh, that is awesome. That is so cool. So did you think you'd be like building this world and living in this world? And
no, I mean, it's weird the way a book comes about. I mean, you start with this like little tiny seed of idea, and it just grows and grows and grows, and it just, I mean, it becomes this weird thing, and it has momentum of its own. And it, like, I mean, people say this so much, it sounds like a cliche, but like, it takes you places like you did not think it was going to go. Even like a writer like myself, who is like always pretty well prepared and meticulously outlined and that sort of thing. Like, I have the whole story kind of mapped out before I start. It still takes you the craziest places and the craziest turns. And like, before I know it, I had the aisle drawn out on my wall and like all these different places. I mean, it was wild. So no, I never thought, I don't know. No, to answer your question, no.
Did you ever fight with the outline as you were writing?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there were some massive changes through the writing process, and there are things that like that make sense in an outline that once you get to a certain point in the book, just don't anymore.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like a character just takes on a different color or a different direction, and all of a sudden, like, they just don't want to do the things you think they should do, and you have to listen to that. You can't, force them to do those things. Like, they are who they are now, like, and you have to let them do what they should do, not what you want them to do.
Yeah. I think that's where I mean, I always wondered, because I hear some authors, they don't ever do outlines, and they just kind of like open
they just
the
go
vein.
for it. That scares the shit out of me, and I'm not sure how they do it. There needs to be a little bit of that, I think, but I could never do that like whole hog. I don't know how they do that. It blows my mind.
How long did it take you to write it?
The first draft was probably 5 months, 6 months, something like that. And then the editing process, probably double that,
Who helped you edit? Did you have a group of readers or
just my family?
Wow.
To be frank, like, I didn't really send it to a lot of people. Just my close family, who are all big readers, and a couple really, really close friends.
Did they look at you different after you gave it to them?
A little bit. A little bit, yeah. Because that's really the first thing of mine any of them really ever read, because nobody wants to read a script, like, you know what I mean? That's not like, so yeah, they did, but they all also really loved it, and they all, like, to their credit, all sort of got it. Got the good parts about it as well as like the bad parts. So I sort of knew I was onto something good, when I got their reactions. So
yeah, you can't have horror without heart. You got to have some sort of investment. And I loved the three main characters, and Catherine and Mark.
Mm-hmm.
Catherine, right? Catherine. I just read it. In my mind, her name was Catherine.
Oh yes.
I was like, what? I just loved how they just were just carefree, naive people, and headed into it. And the major twist, and this is an absolute spoiler about Eamon's heritage. Did you plan that? Did you know that's how he was going to be tied to the estate?
All right. So to be completely transparent, not when I started writing. That came about. I started writing the first draft knowing that there was something missing, but not knowing what it was. So I just had this feeling that like there's some thread that like that like I need to tie this all together, but like I just didn't know what it was until the characters got further developed, like until I got to know them better.
Yeah.
And then at some point about halfway through it sort of clicked and I went, oh, that's it. That's the thing that makes it all make sense, you know.
Boom. Yes, for
Yep.
sure. Totally. Like, so when you initially wrote it, did Eamon have that history with his dad in the woods and living off the grid and all that? So he already had that.
Yeah, it was sort of a happy coincidence.
That's
actually.
crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, I think your brain is playing 5D chess and it's coming from a place that the stories are already there. And it's just saying, hey, here, keyboard monkey, type this out for me.
Well, I think that's very true. I think sometimes it's just a matter of like doing, doing the right work to find it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like your lateral mind works in weird ways and it knows stuff that you don't. And it's just like doing the right like excavation to figure out where it is. Sometimes it feels that way, you know, and sometimes you can only get that from starting to write the thing and getting, you know, 100 pages into it. And, you know, I don't know.
So where does your neuroscience degree come in there?
I don't know if it does, man. You know, that was I never did anything with that degree professionally. That degree ended in school. And it was a really, really interesting subject, and still is fascinating. But you know, it's not like I have a PhD or anything. I mean, I have an undergraduate degree. So I don't know if it does.
Too modest. I mean, that's pretty hefty.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a tough subject. But I don't know how much that comes into play. I don't know. I'm not sure if I find myself writing about that subject matter at all. So I don't know.
To be invested so far into that, to graduate with a degree, like what did you think? What did young Jonathan?
I mean, you know, at that point, I was probably either going to get a PhD or pivot and go to medical school. Potentially, I had been thinking about that for a while, but I'll be honest, when I graduated, the last thing I sort of wanted to do was go back to school again.
Oh, man. Yeah.
So yeah, for whatever reason, college was great and everything, but I did not find that thing that I was like, I want to do this for the rest of my life there. So I didn't really feel connected to that experience for whatever reason. So I took a year off to figure out what I was going to do. And sort of that turned into 10 years off and so on and so forth. I'm still in that year off, you know, in a way.
It's awesome. How does it feel though? Like, okay, now I talked to Thomas Oldehoevelt. He wrote Hex.
Sure.
He wrote it at a young age. It was a huge success. And
amazing book.
It is. And it gave him paralysis. Like after that. Now, I hope to God you can take a page from his book. Obviously, I'm not saying you're going to have that, but does that weigh on you? Do you think like this book is so huge?
It does. I had a little bit of that for sure. Because it's like, well, what do you do next? And the big question of like how similar or how different and which is better? And is it better to do something, you know, different and show your range? Is it better to stay in that same lane because you know it's successful? Is it, you know, it's like all these questions are just running through your head at all times. And I think there's no way to avoid that. Like, so I definitely had a lot of that. And until I was like, you know what, like all you can do is find a story that you feel is important to tell and that you think can hold your attention for 2 or 3 years. Like, and those are the two big things for me. Like by the end of writing a book, you have read it so many times that you still have to enjoy it after the 50th time, you know, after the 60th time, like to be able to put the work in to make it good. So those were the two things I settled on. I was like, you know what, forget genre, forget this, forget that. Just find something that feels important to you and that you think is interesting and go from there.
I've heard some authors, they say they write something, they put in a drawer for a while, then they go back to it, and then they're like reading it with fresh eyes. Did you do any of that? Is that something that is helpful?
I probably didn't do as much of that as I should have because I was in a weird self-imposed rush just to get something in people's hands, like
Yeah.
because it was I started writing this during the pandemic, because the entertainment industry was gone for 18 months and I didn't have anything to do. I had no job. And so I was in this sort of weird rush where like, okay, I need, I just need to get this out there. I need to have something to show for like all these efforts. And that for me, it just felt like the sooner I could do that, the better. So I probably didn't take as much time as I should have in some areas. But I mean, no process is ever perfect, So
Yeah, the book doesn't feel rushed at all. It doesn't feel like, especially with the way the plot justifies and it's like you get pieces and clues all along, and then by the end you're just, okay, I get it. I know why these things happen, which is very important.
Super important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And to an author, I think,
Yeah.
It's like you need the why is incredibly important. For sure.
Now, the funny thing is, now I didn't plan on doing this, but when I wrote my Goodreads review, I sat down and I wrote a poem based on like the passages.
What?
Yeah.
Okay.
I did totally. It was totally spontaneous. I swear to you, I was just going to say, like, the first line popped into my head and it just happened to rhyme, and then I went with it. And then, but reading it back, I realized I wrote mine to the cadence of A Boy Named Sue.
No kidding. With the Johnny Cash song?
Yeah. So
yeah.
And I thought, because it was strictly, I didn't have your book in front of me, and I was just writing it. And I thought, what are the points I want to make? And I'm being real cute and really self-indulgent. But did you have that cadence in mind of when you wrote the poem? No, you didn't.
No, not intentionally. No, I think it's just a fairly common cadence.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah.
And it really, again, like with the illustrations, really tied in that whole the vibe. And what I loved about the poetry and the poem in it is how now we're getting Edward's version, and how it is sort of, it's just this sort of blissful, candy coated, and then you feel like he didn't just kidnap these animals, and they say, you say this in the book, he stole their very story. I mean,
that's right, and kind of changed it in parts too. And like you can tell that, I mean, there's parts where they talk about how they're not happy about it, and the world sees me like as something I'm not. And I love the way the poems tie into the story. Like that's I was really happy with that, and just how they kind of inform each other at certain parts, and also how the poetry is a little like break every now and then, at the beginning of each part, just from the action and from the flow of the story. And so I was really happy with the way that all turned out.
Were you shocked that the books of horror community and the horror collectors really went crazy for it? I mean, when you released it, did you think that would be the response?
No, not at all. I was definitely shocked. I mean, that's a big, serious group of readers.
40,000
and like a powerful group of readers. Like when a book really pops off in a group like that, specifically that group, it changes that book's whole history. And it did that for mine, like 100%.
So how did you do marketing for it? Because
I reached out to, gosh, I don't even know, 1,500 bloggers, influencers, bookstagrammers, like all that stuff. I mean, literally, I still have the spreadsheet actually with like 1,500 or 1,600 people, and I just sat there for a month or two and just reached out to people and go, hey, can I send you a copy of my book? Can I send you a copy of my book? And you don't hear back from all of them, but you hear back from some of them. And
wow,
it just so happened that I think enough of them read it and really loved it that like word happened to get around. And then like one day somebody posted in Books of Horror, and I wish I remember who the first person to post about it was. I don't. I wish there was a way to look back and find it, but somebody posted like this crazy glowing review about the book. And I remember checking my sales the next day and going like, what has happened? Like, and
Wow.
I didn't realize what had happened, I think, until a couple weeks after a reader of mine was like, hey, by the way, this is going on in this group. And I wasn't even a member of the group at the time. You know what I mean? So I didn't really know anything about them.
Yeah.
And I just, yeah. And it just, it continued to be this crazy thing in that group for like a long, long time. And just changed changed everything for me, essentially.
That is so awesome. Yeah, that really is, because there are a lot of books that get served up there, and like I said before, sometimes I dip in, and
Sure.
their tastes are a little more extreme than
They are. Those are serious horror readers.
yeah, they are.
Yep.
And so I didn't know, like I kept looking for. I mean, there were the dark elements, and but yeah, I definitely would not classify this as extreme horror.
I don't think they would either. I think the big thing that they really liked about this book, because yes, they are horror readers, but they are also book lovers. That is a
Yeah.
group of book lovers.
Yeah.
Those are people that read, and they read all the time, and that's the majority of what they do in their free time. And so the fact that it was a horror adjacent book about a book and about book lovers, I think, is the thing that that they really connected with.
So how long have you been taught? How long ago did Suntup contact you?
I want to say about a year and a couple months. I mean, it was pretty early on in the process. I want to say about 6 months after it was published, somewhere in there. So, I mean, really, when it started popping off in the Books of Horror group. But yeah, so fairly early on in the process, like they spotted it sort of when it was really on its way up. So yeah.
And how were they to work with? What did they say about your book and why they picked it? Or
Yeah, they were fantastic. Like I said, I wasn't sure it was real when I first heard about it from them, but they've been great, and they gave me, a selection of artists to choose from, and I got to really, really have some say into like who did the interior artwork for the book and that sort of
that's
thing.
awesome.
Yeah, so it's really been great. They've been fantastic to work with. So, and I like cannot wait to see the final product. Like,
Oh my God, neither can I.
Super stoked about it. So,
yeah. Did you already sign the sheets?
Yes.
How was that?
Yeah, Seats have been shined. It's more work than you'd ever think it would be to to sign your name 1,000 times, or I think 750 times in total, or whatever it was.
Right.
Yeah. But it was cool, man. It was cool just to sit there and do that, and but a lot of work, a lot of hand cramps,
So what's next? What do you got coming out?
So next book is called Jonah the Giant, and it's due out in April, in next April. So sort of similar in that it's also a darker fantasy sort of set in the real world, but definitely very different as well. So
Are you also self-publishing that?
I am, yes.
So that's coming out, you said April?
April.
Oh, well, we got to get that. And what's it about? Does it have anything to do with Winterset Hollow?
No, it doesn't. It's a pretty classic premise of like a giant being forced out into the real world and trying to find a place that he feels accepted and that sort of thing. But it's set in the Depression era Midwest.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. So which is like a period of time I love. Like I'm a huge Steinbeck fan and stuff like that.
Wow.
And so it's a pretty gritty story about how that all happens and sort of who's pursuing him and why. And it's like this really deep, rich, textured like character study on a number of fronts, and also like a pretty exciting adventure story with some fantasy elements in it. So
that's really cool.
Yeah.
I heard rumor, I couldn't verify it with all of my impressive internet research skills, but I heard is there going to be a Winterset Hollow movie?
You heard rumors, did you?
I did. I don't know if any of that's true.
I mean, I can't say anything definitive yet because there's so much up in the air with the writer's strike going on. And that sort of thing. Yeah. However, I mean, we do have a deal with the studio for a project with a couple very, very serious and like well-known people attached to it. I don't even know if I'm allowed to say who like right now.
Better safe than sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think so. But hopefully once the strike is over with and all that is settled, and I get the green light to say something, you will all certainly know about it. But again, I've been through that process so many times to know that it is full of pitfalls, and so hopefully this one goes smoothly, and we get to see something. And as soon as I get the word that I could say something, I will certainly let everyone know. But very cool things in the works. So
and I gotta say that what's really interesting when I was thinking about that is that I think the book definitely would translate beautifully in a totally different way to a movie. So like what I loved about the book was the writing and the beauty of the prose and the cadence and all of that stuff, the pacing, the plotting, and that works as a book should. But a movie, obviously it's operating under different physics, and
yeah,
I think this would also be a great movie.
I think so too. I mean, when I write, I'm a very visual person. I love like storyboarding and that sort of thing. And so I always think about the stories I write in very visual terms. And so when I was writing this, I was like, oh man, this would be great if it was could be a sort of Guillermo del Toro-esque, you know what I mean, story.
Yep.
Where like yeah, sure, we're talking animals, but like very dark. And so I definitely had those vibes in mind, when this was being created. So I would love to see it too. I mean, wouldn't that be ironic if I finally got a movie made by writing a book?
Would you do the screenplay for Winterset Hollow, or
I don't know. That would depend on a lot of things. It would depend on I don't think I would have that in there as I must write that. I'm not sure I have time to do it, actually, to be fair.
Yeah.
I would consider it if the people involved wanted me to, but there also are probably people better suited to do that, than me. So if one of them happened to be involved, I would be happy to let them do it as well. So
yeah, I think it's a very, I think it would be a very delicate process, because you have to create distance between you and this other thing.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would be able to do that. I don't know. I've never had to adapt one of my own books. So I don't know, man. I don't know. That's probably a pretty tough ask now that I think about it,
Yeah, I think it would be. So, well, I appreciate you taking the time to talk.
Yeah, of course.
It was an incredible book. I can't believe, what a roller coaster it must be for you to do this, to get it done, to stick to your guns, to get the book done the way you wanted it, get the acknowledgement from the fine press world and all that. What a crazy, crazy trip. But it's for sure cemented the fact that I will be looking up your next book in April. And
right on.
Because it's not a fluke. This is not a fluke. This is
let's hope not, right?
The sophomore slump. No,
Yeah.
I think and there's so much to explore with Winterset Hollow. Like just this also with prequels and
yeah, I think so.
All that to come, whatever happens in the movie and all this stuff. It's really remarkable. And then they'll be going to your island someday to find out.
Oh no. Yeah, I mean, potentially I'll have to get an island first. There's got to be some for sale somewhere.
There's got to be something.
Right?
One of these libertarian tech gurus are going to sell theirs someday.
Yeah.
This economy.
Yeah, I'll keep my eye out. Yeah.
All right. Well, congratulations and all
Thanks,
the
man.
best. It's unfair that you're so humble, together, smart, and your Instagram's hilarious too.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
It's kind of unfair, but you're hogging all the talent. But thank you for joining me, and happy release day, happy barley day.
Yeah.
And happy hunting.
Thanks, man.
All right.